Hello and welcome to the 1916 Company Podcast. I'm Tim Mosso here with Armand Johnston. The podcast starts now. Armand, before we kick off our main topic, what is the coolest watch or the coolest thing that has crossed your desk this week?
Well, coolest and most interesting, I'll kind of put in the same category, and it's not necessarily the watch, much more what happened to the watch. So a colleague of mine was looking at a piece, and we ultimately have to send it in for stock repair, but we were looking at a code 1159, time date, and, well, the 7 o'clock lug became detached, and that was quite a surprise to me. And, we were talking a little bit before starting recording. I'm sure it is a manufacturing hiccup versus a design, but that was the most interesting thing that had come across my desk. I have not seen a lug fall off of a precious metal watch ever.
Just to be clear, this is not a detachable lug.
It is not a detachable lug. It is a soldered lug.
Okay, so maybe some contamination in the weld. Not really sure. The steel case is still a relatively new thing for the code 1159. Who knows? Maybe there are some growing pains. It happens. I mean, AP will back up the owner. That is not a problem. It's interesting to see when early build models of new watches have those teething pains, so to speak.
And early build and even second generation now.
Yeah, I mean, the watch model itself, the 1159 now, can you believe it's been 5 years?
I've had that thought the other day.
But the steel one is new, and in some ways the best of the lot, but again, growing pains.
Note on code as well, I recently learned that it is an anagram, and it stands for Challenge, Own, Dare, Evolve.
Yeah, they had this thing that they told to us at SIHH in 2019 where they're trying to make sense of it, and it's almost like they were speaking through gritted teeth. But they said, 1159 is just before the new day. I'm like, yeah, but the problem is you didn't specify. It could be just before lunch.
Lunch, exactly.
Fair enough.
What about you? What was the coolest or most interesting piece that you saw this week?
A much less expensive steel watch that needed no repairs. The best watch to own if you've got a big wrist. I have sung the praises of Zenith's Pilot Double-Matic before, but folks, if you haven't seen this thing, I'm not surprised. It wasn't well marketed. They didn't sell a lot of them. But in 2012, the year everyone was talking about the Type 20 Montre d'Aéronef with the 5011K chronometer movement, cool watch, but the best watch that year was a 45mm steel chronograph that combined solid block lume numerals. They are three-dimensional blocks. It had a big date, El Primero chronograph, automatic winding, alarm with on-off, an alarm power reserve that changes color, and a world time complication. This is one watch. And you can get them for under 10 grand, box and papers. That watch doesn't show up too often. We did get one, and I lamented my lack of wrist girth. And as a cyclist, I'm never going to be able to wear a 45mm watch. But if you are that guy, 17 centimeter circumference wrist and up, step up, your watch has arrived. Double-matic, highly recommended.
Crazy bang for buck.
Without a doubt. So what we're going to talk about today is a brand that's really known for bang for buck, and I think, unfortunately, a little bit of that is down to the ebb and flow of the company's fortunes, but Ulysse Nardin has had high highs and low lows since the 1980s. In 1983, Rolf Schneider, who had been an East Asian distributor of Swiss watches for largely a career at that point already, bought an old manufacturer of mostly marine chronometers out of Loloc, Switzerland. And Schneider came in with new ideas and no dogmas. So UN at that point was basically building watches up from parts and performing service on its old pieces. And it had been known in the 19th and early 20th century as a maker of navigation clocks. And they were still doing, I wouldn't say a brisk business, but enough to keep the lights on. Schneider changed things rapidly, an infusion of cash right out of the gate, refocusing on wristwatches, and he brought in people like Ludwig Axelin, who had grown into his place in the watch industry by starting as a restorer of celestial clocks for the Vatican. And a lot of these clocks were designed to calculate the vernal equinox. So Axelin learned how to create incredibly abstruse celestial complications in ways that were reliable and durable, and most critically, would fit in a watch. So they launched the Trilogy of Time starting in the late 80s. Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, telariums, planetariums, everything and more relating to the stars, the moons, the sun, and the earth. Now, in the 90s, they built up with new models along the lines of Oxland's GMT plus minus, his perpetual Ludwig mechanism, and the role continued through internationalization of the company in the 2000s as they established overseas distribution, particularly in the United States. They really leaned heavily into the Russian market, which worked great up until about 2014 when Russian commerce really took a nosedive with the invasion of Crimea and sanctions. That's when the company was at an inflection point, and Chai Schneider, the widow of Rolf, sold the company to Kering. And after 8 mostly listless years of declining fortunes but great watches, the company was sold to its management with Gerard Perregaux in 2022, and that is where it is right now. It is run by its management. It is owned by its directors. So, Armand, just in terms of Ulysse Nardin, what kind of customer buys this watch right now? Let's say the turnaround is underway, but who is the guy right now who wants UN?
You know, I think there's a couple of guys right now that want UN. You know, I think something like a Maxi Marine or UN Diver plays very well in the current space. You know, it is that luxury sports watch. Granted, you know, largely on either alligator or rubber, you get options there. I think when a lot of people are looking at your standard, whether you're looking at Seamasters, whether you're looking at Breitling Super Oceans, things of the like, steel sports watches, stainless steel sports watches, you could look at UN very easily and quite honestly reach towards the precious metal in sports watch. So I think that is one type of collector that's looking for it. The other, I think, interesting complications, and to speak what you were speaking on early, interesting complications for a decent price point. A few weeks ago, we had a group of gentlemen in. We were looking at UN, and one of the gentlemen picked up a platinum dual-time perpetual calendar. And it was priced in the mid-teens. It was a 42 millimeter, extremely wearable, extremely complicated, extremely settable and usable timepiece that unless it was shown to you, you may not know that it is in existence. You may not know that it was produced.
Was it the El Toro?
It was.
It was. Okay. The El Toro, guys, like here's an example of something that if it were made by Richard Mille would cost an absolute king's ransom. And you said it was what, 15?
15,000.
Okay. So what does this watch have? Let's go over a bidirectional perpetual calendar by Ludwig Oxland, a COSC chronometer certification, a 24-hour display that gives it full GMT capability, 100-meter water resistance, full loom, automatic winding, a movement of Ulysse Nardin's own fabrication, and limited edition exclusivity. I believe that was a 500-piece limited edition. Platinum case, ceramic bezel. This thing's off the hook. If you've got the wrist for it, and I do have to qualify some of these watches accordingly. If you have the wrist for it, what a machine.
I would agree with that sentiment exactly. This one in particular was one that I think you or I, Tim, could wear pretty comfortably. You have roughly a 6.5 inch wrist. I have roughly a 7 inch wrist. You could probably wear it comfortably down to a 6 inch wrist. The lug end to lug end measurement wasn't extreme. The most hefty measurement of the watch probably was the weight, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I'll be totally honest about that watch. It needs a full clasp because it is monstrously heavy.
I completely agree.
But there you go, Ulysse Nardin, not shorting you the precious metal. And something that I found relatively remarkable was my recent interview with Mathieu Haverland, who is the director general, or managing director, I should say, of Ulysse Nardin. Now, he is part of the management that bought it back from Kering. He's an equity stakeholder. He's running the day-to-day. The CEO is like a corporate father who watches over the family, whereas this is more like the person who's the head of the household. So he's a playmaker. And he said that one of the biggest concerns they have is what you just described, which is a lot of inventory floating around at a huge discount from original retail and lowering the overall impression of the brand. Because I think if a brand is going to have equity, it can never be too available. And if you can go out and buy a platinum limited edition multi-complication and find several of them for sale on Chrono and eBay, it's too available. So they spent tens of millions of dollars after they bought the company back, buying up inventory, and he was clear that particularly with the precious metal pieces, when they took them off the market, they destroyed them. Mechanical parts were kept for spares, dial parts were kept for spares, cases were melted down. And I think it's bold, first, to do that, because most companies don't want to put up the capital necessary, but also to speak openly about it. I think destroying your own product is a very personal kind of admission that the company went astray in the past.
I also think it is an acceptance of reality and a push towards the future. I think Cartier is known to destroy their own product as well, or has been in the past, and make fanfare about it, quite honestly. And I salute a brand that does that, because it is acknowledging potential mistakes. It's acknowledging what the weak spots of the brand are, but it's also acknowledging that they want to continue to provide value to their customers. And I think that is such an underlying thread that brands that do this don't really advertise quite as loudly as they could.
And it's important to note that if you own that watch, it's like owning stock in a company that uses surplus profits to go and buy back shares. It's going to take shares off the market, which is going to make what you have more valuable. And it's also going to improve the company's appearance, because earnings per share is based on shares outstanding. If the shares are bought back up, you have the same profits, but you have higher profit per share. So it makes the company look better from a corporate standpoint, but it also sort of shows solidarity with the people who had the genuine goodwill to come out and take a chance and buy the property in the first place. And I hate to use this financial jargon when I'm talking about watches, because it is such an emotional thing, but I think UN has to survive as a company before it can really think about being an art house. And so this was a move that was remarkably honest, a raw admission from someone that mistakes had been made, but I also think a sign that it's going in the right direction. And like you said, Cartier, along with Rolex and Omega, is one of the three most, I would say, valuable watch brands in Switzerland based on revenues, and Cartier's ability to control inventory is closer to Rolex than it is to Omega.
Without a doubt. And I mean, it's shown on the secondary market with Cartier prices as well.
Now, I will say this about UN. There's still a lot of really cool watches out there. I don't think they were destroying art pieces, automaton. I don't think they were destroying enamel dials. They were destroying mass-produced watches. So if you want to go out and get something like a Classico cloisonné enamel dial, if you want to go out and find a mega yacht on Chrono 24, I don't think they're dismantling those kind of things. So don't shed too many tears.
You know, I was just eyeing up the Trilogy of Time trilogy, and for when they came out, they're remarkably modern watches.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing there was that it was a very early example of how a watch is more than its base movement, because you have the Kepler, you have the Galileo, and you have the Copernicus, and you have these hardcore celestial modules, and they're built on ETA automatic bases. And there were several generations of them. They started very small and very vintagey, and it's rare that I even see one for review. Given how many watches I see per year, a few thousand, it is exceptional how few of these change hands, and I think that's because people who have them know what they have. We're seeing them come up for auction more, and I think their place in the pantheon of modern collectible watches, they're full vintage now. I really think that's being recognized, with the full set being particularly collectible if you can get them all together. And I think that's interesting because this whole concept of new vintage is just beginning to dawn on the watch industry, that things made after the quartz crisis in the 80s and the 90s are now considered vintage watches. And I think the stuff that's held up best against the clock, against, I guess, the ravages of time and fashion, is what people want most. They want Zenith-powered Daytonas. They want first-generation tritium dial Vacheron overseas. They want early Patek, 3710 Power Reserve Nautiluses, things that have held up well. The Tellurium and the Planetarium and the Astrolabium have all held up really well. And so I think UN is sort of contributing to that vanguard of collectible neo-vintage watches.
I think with this line of timepieces as well, it speaks to rarity, in the sense of I completely agree with you about the collectors holding these pieces, really understanding what they have. And, it's probably some guys that couldn't afford them at the time and purchased them after the fact, which I find is a collector that very seldomly sells. But beyond that, again, just speaks to rarity. There are few of these out there.
Now, I'd also say that if you're looking at 90s and 80s era Ulysse Nardin, a couple things to keep your eye out for. The 1994 San Marco was the dawn of their GMT plus minus system, and it's a very important watch in Ulysse Nardin history. Also, 1996 marked the arrival of the first Ulysse Nardin marine chronometer wristwatch, which is a beautifully compact and classically beautiful watch. And I think if there's one objection people have to a lot of UN, it's that after 2000, catering to the Eastern European market, the watches became too big, too weird, and too gold. And so the 1996 marine chronometer was nothing like that. A limited edition, an enamel dial, a chronometer certification, and beautifully sized and shaped. It stood the test of time. That year's Perpetual Ludwig is also highly collectible because that was the first appearance of Ludwig Oxland's bidirectionally settable perpetual calendar. So 1990s UN has a lot to offer. And then in 1999, we got the watch that sort of put it all together, which was the GMT plus minus perpetual, limited edition, white gold, yellow gold, rose gold, 39 millimeter GMT bidirectional perpetual calendar, automatic winding, a really cool watch. And at 39 millimeters, 38 millimeters, very, very wearable. So if you're looking at like modern collectible UN, that's where you want to look. Those are the models to target.
I also feel like these are just not looked after as perpetual calendars. You know, when collectors talk about perpetuals, they oftentimes the thought is, oh, the entry level is going to be $40,000+. But this is a perpetual that is in-house. It is gosh.
Well, I think the best way to describe it is completely original because the best perpetual calendar system on the market before UN's was the Kurt Klaus system from IWC. But that had two problems. One, it could only adjust in one direction, which led to a lot of heartache when people rolled past the current date. Some people attempting to wind the watch or set the watch would wind up setting it so far forward that they would have to let it sit for weeks or months at a time or send it back to IWC for corrections. And then the other problem with the Kurt Klaus system was that sometimes in the case of JLC watches using the mechanism, you would have to set it with a little pusher adjuster instead of the crown system IWC used. So if the watch sat in a case for a couple of years, you would wind up having to push that little button hundreds or thousands of times. So the Oxland system fixed both those problems by setting through the crown and turning in both directions. And it was brilliant. It was remarkably durable too, being based on wheels.
And it's something that it eliminates the most annoying part of a perpetual, which is setting it. I am a believer in interacting with your watches and understanding every aspect of the mechanics of them. However, I can understand if a perpetual is your potential daily wearer. Well, granted, hopefully you won't have to set it daily, but I can understand in a rush not wanting to set it or not feeling the need to go grab your stylus to set it. So really this mechanism made it, and I hate to use the phrase, idiot-proof.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is fantastic even today, and my goodness, we're closing on 30 years since it debuted. And, you know, just charting the milestones, 2001 brought another one with the original version of the Freak. I've called this the Watch of the entire modern era. We've got a dial side carousel tourbillon. I know there's some debate on whether it's a carousel or a tourbillon, but I think it's probably safe to call it a carousel tourbillon for practical purposes. We got a silicon escapement, which was the first use of silicon in a major watch, and then we got a double direct impulse escapement. We got 7 days of power reserve, sort of heralding the arrival of really long power reserve watches. And so between the fact that the movement was on the dial side, it had a long power reserve, it had a double direct impulse escapement, and it opened the era of silicon. There's something of the Freak in maybe 50 to 60% of the high horology watches on the market today. And that's really saying something considering it was a niche watch at the time from a niche brand.
I absolutely adore the Freak. You know, I must admit, a Freak to me does not have a crown. So we'll get to the newer generations of Freak in a moment. But the original blue dial, was it platinum or white gold?
It was originally white gold.
Okay. The original in white gold is everything, what you said, the movement is dial side. There is no dial technically. There is no crown. You see remnants of what the watch industry shows now waving loudly in that movement.
And if you look at other watches that were influential from the period, they're monstrously expensive. I mean, take a look at the first in-house caliber Daytona. If you want to go out and buy a chrysoprase dial, white gold Rolex Daytona Beach, you're going to pay $70,000 to $100,000 now. If you want to go out and buy a Freak today, you can get the second generation Freak, the 28.8, which came out just about 4 or 5 years after the original. You can get that for $35,000. You can get the original for $35,000. And we're talking about something that was earth-shaking in its impact. But again, today, in inflated dollars, it's about $70,000 to get a Freak 1. And we're talking about the original Freak being available for half of that. So you've got a watch that everyone agrees is important, but no one has yet bid up. And I think that's a great opportunity. That's when I tell people, if you've ever had an inkling that you might be interested in owning this, buy it, because someday either auction houses or blogs or social media will discover this watch, and we'll wish we all bought two, one for the wrist and one for the safe.
Pieces like this absolutely do disappear because it's interesting, and it's just on the periphery to where the mass amount of collectors won't see it, but the ones that are looking in that direction absolutely will. And you're right, one day you'll see 24 on Chrono 24, and the next there will be none available.
Yeah, and it happens very quickly, guys. Remember, back in 2015 when I was at Watch You Want, and I think Armin was working at Govberg at the time, we were buying 5711s for $16,000, $17,000. We were selling them for $19,000, $20,000. And there was an active debate among the Patek community about whether a Nautilus was even a real Patek. And even 3700s, the very first Nautilus models, they were on the market at reasonable prices and available. They weren't headlining auction catalogs. So this turned around in the space of, well, about half a decade. And it happened quickly. I remember when vintage Hoyer was cheap in the 2000s. I can remember when Zenith-powered Daytonas were fairly available in the early 2000s after the in-house caliber. Oh my gosh, in-house caliber, everyone's got to have it. Suddenly the wait list was for the 6-digit reference and no one wanted the Zenith. Until they realized how rare they were, then everyone wanted the Zenith. And I remember back in 2014, we'd buy something like a Roger Dubuis by Retrograde Perpetual Calendar Sympathy 37 for maybe $10,000, and we'd sell it for 15. Full box papers with a chronometer card listing Roger Dubuis himself as the regular. And again, $15,000 bought you that watch back then. It doesn't now. If you have an inkling that you might want one, don't wait. Get it now. Not to become rich. This is fear of missing out. This is just fear of missing out on the opportunity to buy it.
Without a doubt, and not to become rich. I like that.
Yeah, like when I was a kid in the 90s, you get a Maserati Ghibli for $45,000. And even with inflation, that's nothing like the $150,000 to $500,000 they go for now. If you have an inkling that you might want one, don't wait. Because unlike a car, watches truly have pretty low maintenance requirements. You can get insurance through Chubb. It's very simple. It's very low cost compared to putting a rider on your home insurance or your property insurance policy. You get a service every couple of years. Most watches can go to a competent specialist. I would send a freak to the factory. But for the most part, compared to insuring and maintaining and fueling a vintage car, a watch is a cheap date. And once you've got it, it only runs as much as you use it. Unlike a car, which, if you go out and you buy like BMW M3, you've got to use it every day. With a watch, you can at least budget for a service and say, look, I will budget 6 months, then I'll pay for the service, then I'll wear it for 5 years. It doesn't control your life like maintenance of a sports car does. So if you think you might want one of these watches, take the plunge. As long as you're not compromising yourself, go out, get that GMT plus minus perpetual, get that first generation freak, get that perpetual Ludwig, or get the trilogy of time. Because someday people are going to look at that trilogy of time and they're going to view it the way they view the FP Journe Vagabondage series today. I'd argue it's more important.
That's a bold statement. I love that, and I think there will be more people that experience that. So those pieces. So I'll agree with you in that aspect without a doubt.
And also, if you look, speaking of FP Journe F.P. Journe designed the monopusher chronograph movement that went into the Ulysse Nardin monopusher chrono from the 90s.
Which is an amazing, amazing piece. It's a 37 millimeter precious metal case, and it's gorgeous.
And, this is another example of how things eventually get discovered, because back when I started in this industry 10 years ago, nobody wanted Collection Privée Cartier Paris, the CPCP collection. You get a tank à guichet in platinum for almost nothing. You could get the white gold Tortue monopusher for sub $10,000 money. Now people know how important they are, and in the case of the Tortue, they know they're looking at an F.P. Journe movement. Whereas I don't think people have quite realized with Ulysse Nardin that you're basically getting the same thing.
And that watch, I've sold a couple of versions of that watch actually based off of the movement directly to F.P. Journe collectors. And that watch is still under 20,000, and it is as classically designed as a 5170.
And I'll also say this, you can find value in here too. Not everyone has $15,000 for an El Toro. Not everyone has $35,000 for a Freak. But in 2003, UN came out with a watch that is frankly the cheapest Richard Mille RM11 ever made. So, let me explain myself. The Marine Annual Calendar Chronograph. So it's an ETA base movement in a 40 millimeter, 100 meter water resistant case. So you're hearing me. 40 millimeters in diameter, steel, 100 meters water resistant. Now, it's got a Dubois de Praz annual calendar chronograph module on top of it. And if you're familiar with the RM11, then you know that double-digit grand dot and the little month display down in the 4 o'clock corner. That's very similar to the RM11, and that's because it's basically the same mechanical module being used in the Ulysse Nardin. So you've got an annual calendar module that's also a chronograph, that's ETA powered for durability, that's 40 millimeters in steel, that's also 100 meters water resistant, so you can swim with it, and it's well loomed. You can get a white dial. You can get a black dial. You've got variety. They made a chronometer certified version too. This is a watch that you can get into for maybe $5-6 grand and have something you can wave in the face of your RM owning friend and justly say, you basically got played. You're the markets guy. I'm not a salesman. I don't know what an RM11 or RM1103 costs right now. What do they cost right now?
Depending on the metal, 200 plus.
Yeah, there we go. A strap on an RM11. You're halfway to the cost of that Ulysse Nardin. This is a great example of a company that always offered value, that offered complications at accessible prices, that has a super deep back catalog of watches that you can find and buy for very little money. And the same is true if you want a craft art. Now, they bought Danze Cadran in 2012. It's a company that specializes in enamel dial, cloisonné dial, also Champlevé, a very high-end enamel dial maker. Well, they started with their classic series in the 2000s, and before that in the 90s, they were already working with Danze. And so they did all sorts of nautical themes, the Russian Krusenstern, the America's Cup inaugural winner America, various types of tall ships and animals, military scenes, horses, beautiful watches with dials that where they signed Anita Porcher, everyone would nod and smile. You can get this watch from Ulysse Nardin's 90s and 2000s back catalog with the exact same quality for under 10 grand.
There's also the more modern series of the hand-painted and enameled pieces with the erotic and aqua life.
Oh, I got a great story about that. Okay, so I was at SIHH in 2019, and UN had a reputation for doing erotic watches, which is not as weird as it sounds.
I'm a fan.
It's a long time Swiss tradition. They've been made since forever. And I guess it started with pervy old guys building watches in their cabins snowed in during the winter. But for the most part, the stuff would be on the case back. Although I will say this, Ulysse Nardin had made them as automata watches with all the weirdness on the front. They actually stripped down, pun intended, this whole concept to do erotic enamel dials in 2019 with Italian artist Milo Manara. And I was in the room when the watches were unveiled, and you could literally hear people gasping because all of this was on the dial, not the case back. And I heard a woman next to me mutter, "Lesbian mermaids." And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I really couldn't have said it better myself.
It's a perfect descriptor, honestly. And the watches are a lot of fun. They're amazing. The work is outrageous.
They are beautifully made. I will say that you got to be bold to wear it. And, heads up, not safe for work. This is the ultimate NSFW watch, like the ultimate NSFW watch.
I was looking at this week also, actually, the Marine Regatta, which is a watch that, quite honestly, I shamefully had forgotten about since it was released. And the Marine Regatta is very, very cool. It is the only chronograph I've seen work in a counterclockwise fashion that wasn't broken. And with, again, a programmable countdown timer, it's outrageous. Tell me what's going to make me like this watch more, Tim.
Okay, well, first of all, the watch is absolutely wild. It probably deserves to be called a Grand Complication. I know there's that classical definition of a Grand Comp being a minute repeater, a perpetual calendar, and a chronograph all in one. But when you have a watch that has just as many parts and is arguably more difficult to build and make work, I think this, along with some watches like the JLC Master Compressor Extreme Lab 2, needs to be considered a modern-day Grand Complication. So what happens is you can program a countdown on the watch. So the chronograph moves backwards from the countdown. When the chronograph reaches 0, having moved backwards from the programmed countdown time, it then reverses itself and starts counting forward the elapsed time. And it might even have a flyback complication built in. So you've got something that has hundreds upon hundreds of parts, and the only thing that's remotely similar to it is the old Glasuta Original panoretrograph, which was priced at the level of a Midwestern house when it came out in 2001.
The retrograph is a really cool watch. I've seen one of those in person, and awesome piece.
The UN is a more complicated watch than that. It's also 100 meters water resistant, automatic winding, stainless steel, and fully loomed. So this is a watch you can wear every day. And it's backed by a real company. This isn't something that was made by some flaky brand like MCT under a guy with a grasshopper mind like Denny Guiguet. UN is going to stand behind this and actually maintain it. It's like when you own a really complicated Patek or JLC, there's a substantial company behind that thing. You don't have to worry about there never being an independent, watchmaker who's got the parts or the tools or the service manuals. You can actually have this thing maintained. And it's actually not that big for what it is.
It's not. It's 44 millimeters. It's just under 15 millimeters thick, which I'd want to take a set of calipers to that myself. But what's the two best things to this on this piece to me are it's original and it's remarkably usable. In not just what it's meant for. It's usable for everything. I use my chronograph for cooking often. I use my chronograph for fun more often, and this does both of those better.
Yeah, if you thought the Yachtmaster 2 was complicated, get ready, because this thing puts the Yachtmaster 2 to shame. And whereas the Yachtmaster 2 is somewhat limited as a chronograph, this can operate as a normal chronograph in addition to its programmable countdown. And it is so fearsomely complex that nothing else like it has come from companies known for complexity. Where's the Urwerk? Where's the Richard Mille? Where's the Grubel 4C? Where's the MB&F? Where's the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Regatta Countdown, to lock horns with this? It's in possession of the field. And I've often said that regatta timers are incredibly useful, just not for their intended purpose. I find very, very few people actually race boats. But the ability to count down the time during an intermission, or before you have to return to a meeting, or before your flight, or when you're cooking, this is the world's most accomplished egg timer.
No comment.
I'm sorry, Ewan. Maybe that's not what they wanted to hear.
No, I think it's perfect. I think it's spot on.
I'll also say this. There's a lot of cool stuff that came out in the 2000s that flies below the radar. Like we talked about the Freak in the annual calendar. There was also the 2006 UN 160 anniversary chronometer. Now, this is a really cool watch. Rose gold and white gold, 500 pieces of each, oval shaped. I feel like every generation has had its oval watch. And this was the oval watch for the 2000s. The 90s had the millenary, the 70s had the Omega Dynamic, and this watch had marine chronometer-like styling. You had the nameplate or the number plate on the side. You had a dial with, screw-fixed nameplate. You had double-digit date, chronometer certification, and rare for the 2000s, a movement that was entirely Ulysse Nardin's own fabrication, the 160 movement, which people don't really realize had the freak escapement. So this is an incredibly sophisticated watch. In addition to being a chronometer and a limited edition and super distinctive, this is actually just technically as audacious as the freak in its use of silicon and a double wheel escapement.
This is almost what the Millenary should have been.
Yeah, actually, the Millenary should have been technically audacious. It wasn't. Right out of the gate, there were a lot of customer calibers, solid casebacks. It was something that was designed to sell more on fashion than on substance. The UN fundamentally realized that the kind of person who's going to buy a quirky watch is also the kind of person that wants the watch to be as interesting inside as it is outside. And the early Millenary didn't have that.
I love this rose gold bracelet version of the 160.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's the kind of thing where you look at the 160 and the blue and the rose gold, it just goes so well together. I like toning it down a little bit with a strap. I know there was a bracelet available. I think the bracelet maybe is, again, catering to the Russian market, which was very, very important at the time. And there was a certain Boca Raton jeweler who was very famous for doing that back in the 2000s and early 2010s. But the watch on a leather strap looks perfect, whether it's the white gold or the rose. Really nice, handsome, beautifully proportioned. And frankly, it needed the bracelet to appeal to the Russian market because without it, it doesn't look over the top or bombastic. And I know, look, I hate to say it, but that was the taste of the market at the time. And I remember, I know a Russian journalist who works in the industry, and she was trying to explain to me why the Russians had the world's largest submarines. And she's like, we love, what is the English word? Gigantisme. And she spoke like Spanish, Russian, English, Italian, and that was the word she chose. And I'm like, even without translation, I know what you mean. The UN 160 could be that, but it was not that exclusively. And I love it dearly. So definitely something to look at. That came out in 2006. And there was actually, I guess they wanted to maybe amortize the tooling for the case. So after they were done making the UN 160, they came out with the Macho Palladium, which was not subtle. But it was the same shape as the UN 160. And it was one of the few Palladium watches through and through that you could buy then or now. And so if you loved that shape, but you wanted something that was a bit more, I guess, technically orthodox that your local guy could service, look for the Macho Palladium. That's definitely the way to go. It's like the UN 160 egg case, which is egg-shaped, and the running gear from the marine chronometer. It's a really good combo. Also important, 2010 was actually a pretty big year for Ulysse Nardin because we got both the El Toro GMT Perpetual that we mentioned earlier, but we also got the first Freak with a no-joke tourbillon. Now, a lot of people think that the Freak is a tourbillon. What it really is a carousel, and I know some people dispute whether it's a carousel, but I'm willing to take them at their word. The carousel is similar to a tourbillon in that it's a carriage that spins the escapement. It was invented by Dane Bonnickson in the 1890s, and the idea was to create something that did what a tourbillon did, but with greater durability. So a carousel has two different drives. One drives the escapement, and one drives the carriage. That's why, with a Freak, you can use the bezel to set the time. If it were a tourbillon, the same drivetrain would drive the escapement and the carriage. So if you were to move the carriage, you would shatter the escapement with all the force that would immediately go through the anchor and the escape wheel. Well, with a carousel, power is continuously provided to the escapement even as you manually move the carriage around to set the time, because the minute hand is also the movement on a Freak. Because it's a carousel and there's two drivetrains, they don't interfere with each other when you set the time. But it's not a tourbillon. In 2010, we got a tourbillon. We got the Freak Diavolo. So if you're familiar with the Diavolo, you know that there's a tourbillon, a 1-minute tourbillon, on top of the carousel, which is critical for two reasons. First, previously Freaks didn't have a seconds hand, and second, Freaks didn't previously have a tourbillon. So now you have something, the likes of which really only Blancpain has done, where you have both a carousel and a tourbillon on one watch.
What a combo too. The Diavolo is amazing. The little red accent, white metal, black dial. The what I'm assuming is a sapphire scale on the tourbillon. Gosh, that is a piece.
It really is. And I'll also say this. The watch, if you're not going to go with the first generation Freak and get the original 42.5 millimeter case, I recommend getting this one because I think the most collectible Freaks in the future are going to be the very earliest models, the first of the Diavolos, and then if you do find something like a Freak Next or a Freak Lab, one of those super low volume semi-production concept watches would be like that example. Like with the Freak Next, you had 12 to 15 watches made, and it used an ultra-high frequency oscillator. So if you're familiar with the thing Zenith called the Dayfi Inventor and later gave up trying to make, this has that. It's got a escapement that is a monoblock silicon oscillator, and unlike Zenith, Ulysse Nardin makes its own silicon. It bought Sigatech in 2006. Normally, if you're talking about companies that can make their own silicon, you're talking about huge consortiums of companies that join together, or something like Swatch Group that is just a monstrous industrial monolith that owns everything. The Freak Next is a freak through and through, but it has a monolithic oscillator that works at super high frequency, and I want to say they made just 12 of these. That would be the thing to get if you're not getting the earliest Freak or the Diavolo. And it had the first generation of the grinder automatic system, and when I spoke to Macho Haverland, he said, when the patents expire on the grinder system, everyone in Switzerland is going to copy it. It's almost like a hybrid of a peripheral rotor and a rotor automatic, because you do have this rotor that orbits the center. It's more efficient, it captures more energy, and it's more durable. And it really is brilliant. And the first use of that with the monolithic oscillator and entertaining use of superluminova was the Freak Next.
I also love that it has a loomed case. That's amazing.
Oh yeah, loomed case, loomed time, the whole thing lights up. It's very entertaining. It's multi-material. I want to say it was a combination of ceramics and platinum, a very sophisticated assembly, and probably the most advanced Freak ever made, assuming the original Freak Lab never really reached customers. No one really knows about that, but if you find a Freak Lab in the wilderness, send me a wrist shot, mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com. Now, in recent years, I think the main problem with Ulysse Nardin has just been too many new models. It's hard to keep track. So let's talk about where Ulysse Nardin is right here. When I spoke to Macho, he said, right now, we're at under 10,000 watches. And we're going to make the heart and soul of the company the Freak. And we're going to limit that to about 1,000 watches a year. So Armand, what are you seeing with recent releases? Things like the Freak with a crown, for example, or the Freak Out in titanium.
So I said earlier, a Freak is crownless to me, largely. I understand the potential manufacturing necessity of making it a little bit more accessible and a little bit more user-friendly. And after spending a little bit of time with some of the newer Freaks, I do like them a lot. There is a segment to me between a Freak with a crown and a Freak without. You know, Freak X, Freak Adventure, Freak X Ops. They're all awesome. They're all very cool. I like the colorways. I like the design. They're legible. They're wearable. But they all have crowns. And largely, to me, that it's reflected in the price point, for one. So I naturally, I have thoughts and questions.
Yeah, for me, the cheapest Freak, look, I'm not going to lie, it's been a smashing success for Ulysse Nardin. We all want UN to survive and to remain independent, and if it has to make the Freak X, then we may have to just grit our teeth and accept that. But I do think that if you are shopping pre-owned, you're getting a big discount anyway. So I think at that point, you want to look for, at a minimum, what was called the Freak Out that came out in 2018. Now, this was the first base metal Freak, titanium, carbon fiber, these kind of materials, and it retained the 7-day power reserve, the bezel setting, the case back winding, and the no crown profile. So for me, not only is this a more wearable Freak because of the lightweight materials, but it preserves everything that made the original Freak special. Everything from the implementation of Carol Forestier-Casapi's circumferential spring system with the hand in the middle to Pierre Gigac's and Ludwig Oxland's implementation of the carousel and the silicon. All of that is still present in this watch. It's just titanium or carbon.
They did take the design language from the original and refine it slightly and make it a little bit more modern. The Freak Out is very, very cool. This is so a Freak, so what a Freak should be. I have to say, I wonder about UN being shaped around the Freak, because to me, I think of Maxi Marine when I think of UN.
Yeah, people of a certain age, I guess, I'm at the tail end of my 30s, Armand. I think you have a few more years to go. But the main thing is, if you grew up in the 2000s and 2010s, you saw a lot of UN Marines, Maxi Marines, and Maxi Marine divers. And these kind of defined the brand for you. There were always the complications, which were incredible. But if you went out to some place like Tourneau or Vempe or Bucherer, depending on where you are in the world, you probably saw some variety of Marine. And that was probably what you associated with Ulysse Nardin. Now, they do have their diver line today, and particularly with the caliber 118, which is their own movement, you're getting a lot of value. Chronometer certification, silicon escapement, silicon hairspring, free sprung, 60-hour power reserve, automatic, very shock resistant. It's a diver that doesn't look like a Seamaster or a Sea Dweller or a Submariner. This is really, in my opinion, like the last flag flying from that era when ETA-powered watches really defined the catalog and flew the flag in volume and made UN a brand a person could maybe get into immediately after Rolex and Omega, instead of being something that, you started looking at once you had Grubel Forsey or Erwerk or MB&F money.
That's a good distinction of where a collector does kind of get into the brand. And it is, it's oftentimes it's not the first choice, it's not the second choice, but it certainly should be in the conversation of those, just due to the variance in what you get in the collection, albeit without having too many SKUs.
So now, moving on to whether 10,000 is too many, here's a problem I see. Now, Macho tried to kind of explain this away, and I consider his answers all to be in good faith, but you've got to be ready to kind of swing at the curveball or lay off. And I think he laid off a little bit when I asked him, how do you distinguish between Girard-Perregaux and UN? Because not only are they of similar volume, similar price point, in my opinion, a similar customer, kind of a seasoned watch nerd type thing, but they're also sharing common production facilities at this point. So they are very much twinned. The business offices are the same, marketing is separate, product design is separate. But I know, he says, look, Girard-Perregaux is chocolate, Ulysse Nardin is passion fruit. You're not going to cross-shop a Marine Diver and a Laureato. And I would say, sure, but you might cross-shop something like a Blast and a Neo Bridge. Or you might cross-shop a Esmeralda with a Freak. Or you might cross-shop the Constant Escapement with a Freak. And I do kind of think that when you look at these high complications they've got, especially if the Freak is now going to be like 10% of all production or more, I do think the guy who buys a Freak looks at the Neo bridges. He looks at the Neo Constant Escapement. He looks at some of the Tourbillon offerings from Girard-Perregaux.
I think he looks at Laureato also.
You think so?
Yeah, very much so.
Mostly because he's an open-minded guy who's not going to pay the premium for a Nautilus or a Royal Oak?
I think Freak is inherently sporty to a certain degree.
Okay, I'll buy that. It certainly in titanium or carbon fiber, it's not a dress watch. But I do think when you get into the world of like Girard-Perregaux triple axis tourbillons and Ulysse Nardin automaton strikers, you're talking about the same guy. When you're talking about blasts and you're talking about Neo bridges, you're talking about the same guy. When you're talking about the Constant Escapement and the Freak, you're talking about the same guy. I do think Girard-Perregaux has some classical pieces, but then again, the Classico series at Ulysse Nardin is literally that. And I think the guy who's looking at a mega yacht would look at a Girard-Perregaux triple axis tourbillon minute repeater and say, yeah, that's up my alley. Like, I have to make a choice here. These are both appealing.
I would agree with that. That's an interesting point because the two are strangely adjacent in design language and market share.
similar customers, similar price points, similar products, similar model lines, similar appeal. So in terms of setting GP and UN apart, I think they've got their work cut out for them. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I don't think it can be done without making UN watches really outrageous. Because there are some avant-garde pieces in Girard-Perregaux's current catalog already.
I think part of it too is well, for example, I think Gerard Perregaux needs to slow down a little on Laureato.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I also think that with GP, you've got the WWTC or the Traveler WWTC,
Which is amazing.
I think if you're looking at one of the GMT plus minuses from Ulysse Nardin, again, you've got another conflict.
Yeah.
Which one do you get? They're very similar.
They are extremely similar in function. I think it's interesting. There are juxtapositions in case designs, but both case designs have quirks to them, right? You're not talking about solely a round watch. You're not talking about solely standard lugs. So that's you're illuminating this for me even brighter.
So I think that it'll be challenging for UN because I don't really see room for UN to move into the highly profitable integrated bracelet sports watch category, which limits a little bit of its headroom to grow. And frankly, I don't want it to move into that category.
I so agree. I was just about to say, not every brand should have an integrated bracelet sports watch.
I think it's probably better to differentiate UN and GP by genre and style than by price point, because I think there's no doing about the price points. Neither one of them is a hugely entry-level brand, although Ulysse Nardin is somewhat more accessible with a few marine models starting under $10,000. I don't quite think, other than like a casquette, Girard-Perregaux has anything like that. But again, Girard-Perregaux is not like the Classicists brand. We're not talking about Vacheron here. We're talking about a company that has multi-axial tourbillons, constant force escapements. We've got watches with giant bubble sapphires, multiple complications, and in some cases, sapphire cases. I think with a digital LED ceramic watch in the catalog, GP is kind of just as outrageous as UN when it wants to be. Okay, so let's shop the story, so to speak. Let's go to Ulysse Nardin's current website and talk about which watches we think are most interesting. So just right out of the gate, Armand, what are you buying? You've got no budget. You just got to buy something cool. What do you get if you're looking at UN today? Where do you start the collection?
I really like Blast. I know it's not the low-hanging fruit, but I really like it. It's a little bit AP Hublot adjacent, in my opinion, but it's a more original design language. And I honestly may start there because, a UN tourbillon is a very cool thing. If it's not a freak, it's probably a Blast.
So for me, I'm hugely drawn to the Classico series. Just at the moment, again, they're a little bit weird with the Monera pieces, but I think if I'm going to wear a watch every day, I would have to just be really sold on the beauty of it. And I think you look at the dial, you can't wear them upside down. So while UN does offer some dial side movements that are exceptional, I think something like a Classico manufacturer with a non-erotic subject matter would probably be where I start my collection, because I like watches that are suitable for wearing around the office. And when I'm on my bike, when I'm doing athletics, I'm not wearing a watch for reasons of simple self-preservation and watch preservation. So I would start with a Classico. There are a few Monera models. They're just, boats at sea. Beautifully done. And so that's really where I would start my collection. Now, from there, I might move over to the divers, because I do need something that's sporty. If I've got my dress watch, then I need to really think about what kind of water-resistant watch I want to have. Some days when I need to submerge a watch, when it might get caught out in the rain, something that's light on the wrist, that doesn't have the heft of precious metal, but still gives me enough horological interest that it's not just a style job. So I would probably go with the Diver, the Ocean Race, or the Diver Net Azure. So here we go. Diver, the Ocean Race, you're looking at a case that is a hybrid of materials. It's a 200-piece limited edition. Of course, it's associated with one of their sponsorships, as these things tend to be. Now, the watch is 44 millimeters, and It is a UN 118 caliber, so manufacturer, automatic, 60-hour power reserve, COSC certified. We've got a fascinating case that is 40% carbonium, which is kind of like a carbon fiber, and then 60% recycled fishing nets. And you're going to see a lot more of this because Macho told me that they want to distinguish Ulysse Nardin with sustainability, which I'm not sure if that's the right direction for the American market, but for a guy like me who's all about sailboats and road bikes, maybe this is the right choice. Maybe this makes sense. I'm their audience of one for this. So I would go after the Ocean Race. It's a 200-piece limited edition. It's got signature Tim Mosso neon green on the dial, which I love. And I think it's a really cool piece because I do want to have a diver. From there, I go into the Marine Torpilleur collection, where they've done an awesome enamel aventurine glass 42 millimeter watch. It's a 300-piece stainless steel limited edition. It's a moon phase. It's a power reserve. It's probably the closest thing in the catalog today to that original 1996 Marine chronometer, which was just so beautifully balanced and proportioned and detailed. And again, that aventurine glass with the marine chronometer dial layout, the durability of steel, and the horological interest of their own movement. Again, it's based on the 118. That really appeals to me, and I think that's just super cool. So that's where I'd continue. How do you start building out your collection now? You start with something outrageous. Are you going to go classical? Are you going to go with a sports watch?
From there, I would definitely go something with an erotic theme, something with the something nautical and erotic, but I'm seeing something on the Classico collection that only 2 of the offerings are non-erotic. And I have to say, I take my hat off to you, UN. I appreciate this. I appreciate this classicism. I appreciate it all. I love it.
I will say this too. You can get their enamel dials. They've made many series since the 1990s. You're not locked into lesbian mermaids. Trust me, you've got a million different options. Just go on Chrono24, go on eBay, go on the 1916 company website. You're going to find these enamel dials of more classically beautiful and grounded subject matter. So don't worry, the stuff is out there. And I'm just going to give you a quick running update in terms of budget. By far the most expensive watch I've added to my collection so far is the Classico Manera manufacturer, 40 millimeters, and in this case, rose gold. I can deal with it in a dress watch. $44,500. I think that's a little bit problematic on the primary market. I think given that the aventurine dial marine that I talked about is just over 13 grand and the diver is around 12, 44,500 for the enamel dial. You really have to buy into cloisonné and understand what goes into this for it to make sense. Otherwise, you're just going to be, I think, gobsmacked by the price of it. This kind of watch is not cheap.
You're absolutely paying for the craft, paying for the artist doing the work.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think it's the kind of thing where you have to be committed to craft arts and really understand them, because the watch itself is simple. So that's sort of the thing. You need to look at it as you being a patron of the arts, and you are patronizing the craftsmen who happen to work for Ulysse Nardin.
Well said.
Okay, now I'm going to go crazy. I love horlogerie. I love really expensive complications. And there are some spectacular examples at Ulysse Nardin, one of which is the Grand Deck Tourbillon. Now, I was around when this first came out in 2016. I was at Ulysse Nardin's multi-level Baselworld exhibit, and the watch in question featured a teak deck marquetry dial. So it is craft marquetry. They create the image of the deck of a yacht. It had 2 capstans or winches that were fixed to a boom, like the boom of a sailboat, by a system of capstans. So just like the boom of a sailboat, you had a capstan on each side, and there was a retrograde minutes display in the shape of the boom of a sailboat that would jump across the dial. Finally, you had a movement that was excruciatingly handcrafted, beautifully detailed in every conceivable way, and artisanal in all of the right ways, with a jumping double-digit hour at 12 o'clock and a tourbillon at the base of the dial with Ulysse Nardin's proprietary silicone hairspring and immense degrees of hand finishing. So you got UN caliber 630 with a capstan sailboat boom retrograde minute, a double-digit jumping hour, and a flying tourbillon. All of this manual wind, artisanal, and white gold with enough mass to probably sink a ship. So it was nautically themed, but probably a big enough block of precious metal to sink the Titanic.
That's a really cool watch to handle in person and adjust and to watch work.
It is a riot to watch the boom wind across the dial with the capstans and the wire. And also cool about this is that UN designed it to be worn 100 meters water resistant. So I think I would actually go for this before I go for a freak, but I'm not done yet because I do need to add a freak to the collection. The freak I would probably buy, cost no object, would be the freak next. But 12 made, I'm not going to find it. So the freak that I would probably buy would be either the original from 2001 because it's a 42.5 and it's the smallest freak ever made, or I would go with the freak out, which has the titanium case because it's lighter on the wrist. So that would be my path to freak ownership. I will say this. It's not my style because of the rose gold, but the Freak S that came out 2 years ago, aventurine dial, carousel tourbillon, and here's the big part. It had 2 escapements and 2 balances geared together by a differential. And if you've looked at watches historically that have done this, they've been the best of the best. Grubel Forsey Double Balancier, Philippe Dufour Duality, MB&F HM9 Flow by Simon Brett. These are incredible watches. The Freak S is among them. With the grinder automatic winding system, the only thing I don't love here is that it is rose gold intensive. I thought this should have been the Aiguille d'Or for the year it came out. It wasn't. I regret that. I think they chose wrongly. And I'm a member of the Academy, and I voted for it, and whatever. I was overruled. But I think this watch in platinum or white gold or titanium would actually be the Freak I buy over the Freak Out, over the 2001 original, and over the Freak Next, as much as I love it, because it's that special. This thing just looks like money.
It's very much a freak, and it's very much a natural progression freak. When you see the original Freak, you can absolutely see the design language all the way through to the Freak S. And after spending, I think we both spent a little bit of time with this watch while it was here. It's amazing in person. It's a little bit on the large side, but it's not unwearable by any stretch of the word. Honestly, that's a taste thing for me. The complication and the finishing is gorgeous, and I love aventurine. It's a lot of fun. It's a spaceship flying through space.
It is the craziest freak. It is the freakiest freak. And I would say this, guys, it doesn't have to be expensive. I would say that if I were on a budget looking to get into UN, go out and get that 2003 Marine Annual Calendar chronograph. Get yourself that. Get yourself the $15,000 El Toro with the chronometer cert, the GMT, and the Oxlin Perpetual. And then go out and, I would say, finish. And by the way, that's your sports watch. That's 100 meters water resistant, and that's on a rubber strap. After that, I would say start saving up for a freak. And I'm not going to blame you if you go for the one with a crown. Look, I understand financial considerations are real. If you want to get into a freak and you're on a budget, it's going to be that one. Pre-owned. All right, Armand, so one last question. You have a choice between the Ulysse Nardin Mega Yacht and the Ulysse Nardin Marine Grand Deck Tourbillon. Which do you pick? Do you go with a Mega Yacht or a Mega Yacht themed watch?
Mega Yacht themed, and I was going to bring this point up. The speed at which the boom moves is the most impressive part because I find that it's easier to make things move seemingly instant. It's not easy to make things move so you can see them more slowly and make it accurate every time. I think that's a brilliant feat, and I would go with that every single time.
So guys, if you want to see reviews of most of these, check me out on Watchbox Reviews on YouTube. I'm also Tim_Mosso on Instagram. Armand, you are both sales and a social media personality, so how do people reach out to you?
Yes, I am Armand at thewatchbox.com or at It's Me Armand on Instagram.
Time out, Tim out, Armand out, 1916 podcast out. Thanks for logging on.